unjustly accused of murder. She was the only one who believed in him. Introduction. The year was 1900, and the Australian Outback stretched endlessly under a copper sun that seemed to burn the very soul of the land. In the small mining town of Broken Hill, New South Wales, the red dust settled on everything. The weathered wooden buildings, the horse-drawn carts rattling down the main street, and the dreams of men who'd come seeking silver and stayed for reasons they couldn't quite name. It was a place where everyone knew everyone else's business, where a whispered conversation over morning tea could become gospel truth by evening, and where a man's reputation could be built over decades but destroyed in a single day. The town thrived on the rhythm of the mines, the clatter of machinery, and the gossip that flowed as freely as the beer at Murphy's pub. Brian O'Sullivan had lived in Broken Hill for 15 years, arriving as a young man with his bride, Margaret, full of hope and callous hands ready for honest work. He'd built a modest life on the outskirts of town, a small house with a vegetable garden that Margaret had tended with the same gentle devotion she'd shown their son, Ian. When consumption took her 3 years ago, Brian had aged a decade in a single winter. Now, at 52, his dark hair was streaked with silver, his weathered face bore the lines of grief, and his once-ready smile appeared as rarely as rain in the dry season. Brian was known as a man of few words but reliable work. He fixed wagon wheels, mended fences, and helped neighbors without expecting payment. The kind of man who tipped his hat to ladies and never raised his voice, even when provoked. The kind of man who, everyone agreed, wouldn't hurt a fly, which made what happened on that fateful Tuesday morning in March all the more shocking. Catherine McKinnon, at 48, had never married, a fact that provided endless speculation for the town's busybodies. Some whispered it was because she was too clever for her own good. Others claimed she was too particular. The truth was simpler and sadder. Catherine had spent her youth caring for ailing parents who lingered for 20 years longer than the doctor predicted. By the time they passed, she found herself settled in spinsterhood, owner of a small house on Queen Street, and a reputation for having the sharpest tongue and kindest heart in Broken Hill. Catherine ran the general store with efficiency that bordered on artistry. She could calculate figures in her head faster than most men with paper and pencil, remembered every customer's preferences, and somehow always knew exactly what people needed before they asked. Her auburn hair, now touched with premature gray, was always pulled back in a practical bun. The rebellious strands escaped a frame of face that remained handsome despite the harsh Australian sun. She'd noticed Brian O'Sullivan over the years, of course. Hard not to, in a town of barely 800 souls. She'd observed how gently he'd help his wife during her illness, how proudly he'd spoken to their son Ian before the boy left for Sydney to make his fortune. She'd seen the way grief had settled on his shoulders like a heavy coat he couldn't remove. But they'd never exchanged more than polite pleasantries. She respected his marriage, and later, his mourning. On this particular Tuesday, as the morning sun cast long shadows between the buildings and the town slowly came to life with the sound of boots on wooden sidewalks and the distant whistle of the mine, none of them knew that their lives were about to change forever. In small towns, gossip spreads faster than wildfire in dry grass. A whispered suspicion can become accepted fact before the morning tea grows cold. And once suspicion takes root in the collective mind of a community, it grows with the persistence of desert weeds, choking out reason, truth, and sometimes justice itself. Before we continue with Brian and Catherine's story, I'm curious about your thoughts. Write in the comments below. Do you believe small-town gossip can truly destroy a person's life? Have you ever witnessed how quickly rumors can spread and take on a life of their own? Chapter 1, Shadows over Broken Hill. The tragedy was discovered at dawn by Mrs. Ethel Hartwell, who had the unfortunate habit of rising early to check on her chickens and the far more unfortunate timing of choosing that particular morning to investigate why a prize rooster hadn't crowed. What she found in the alley behind Jameson's hardware store would give her nightmares for months and provide the town with enough gossip to last until Christmas. Thomas Jameson, the store's owner and one of Broken Hill's most prosperous merchants, lay motionless in the dust, his head bearing a wound that spoke of violence swift and brutal. His cash box sat overturned nearby, its contents scattered to the four winds by the night's breeze. Mrs. Hartwell's screams brought half the town running. including Constable Robert Henderson, who took one look at the scene and immediately began asking who had been seen in the vicinity the night before. It was then that Murphy's pub provided its most damning testimony. Brian Sullivan had been seen leaving the establishment around 9 o'clock, walking in the direction of Jameson's store. Saw him clear as day, swore Patrick Murphy, the pub owner, mopping his perpetually sweating brow. Looked agitated, he did, more than usual, been drinking alone, nursing the same beer for 2 hours. What direction did he go? Constable Henderson asked, his pencil poised over his notepad, straight toward Jameson's place. Saw him turn down that very alley where poor Tom was found. The fact that Brian had been walking home, his house lay directly on the other side of Jameson's store, seemed to escape everyone's notice. Or perhaps they simply chose to overlook it. By 10 o'clock that morning, the whispers had already begun. By noon, they had grown into murmurs. By evening, those murmurs had crystallized into something approaching certainty in the minds of many townspeople. Always was a strange one that a Sullivan, declared Mrs. Agnes Porter, the banker's wife, as she selected fabric at Catherine's store. Too quiet, if you ask me. Still waters run deep, and not always clean. Catherine looked up from a ledger, her pen poised in midair. Strange? Brian O'Sullivan? The man who spent 3 nights fixing the church roof without asking for payment. Well, yes, but... Mrs. Porter lowered her voice conspiratorially. Grief can change a man. Catherine, make him unpredictable. And he has been struggling financially since Margaret passed. Everyone knows he owes money to half the town. Owing money doesn't make a man a criminal, Catherine replied, her tone sharp enough to cut glass. And since when do we convict people based on the fact that they were walking home from a pub? Mrs. Porter sniffed. I'm simply saying that desperation can drive even good men to desperate acts. Tom Jameson was known to keep considerable cash in that store of his. And Brian was seen. Walking. Catherine interrupted, setting her pen down with enough force to make Mrs. Porter jump. In the same direction he walks every evening to reach his own home. Hardly evidence of criminal intent. But Catherine's words of reason fell on deaf ears. The town had already begun the process of transforming Brian O'Sullivan from neighbor to suspect, from grieving widower to dangerous man. It was easier, somehow, to believe that evil could be identified, contained, and eliminated, rather than to accept that tragedy might strike randomly, that a good man like Thomas Jameson could simply be in the wrong place when a stranger with ill intent passed through their town. That evening, as Catherine closed the store and walked the dusty streets toward home, she noticed how conversation stopped when she passed, how eyes followed her with a mixture of curiosity and disapproval. Word had apparently spread that she had defended Brian O'Sullivan, and in the growing hysteria, such defense was beginning to be seen as suspicious in itself. She found Brian sitting on his front porch, his dinner untouched on the plate beside him, staring out at the endless expanse of red earth that stretched toward the horizon. He looked up as the footsteps approached, and she saw something in his eyes that made her heart clench. Not guilt, but the terrible weariness of a man who had already been tried and convicted by his neighbors. Evening, Catherine, he said quietly, rising to his feet with the careful politeness of a man who still believed in treating ladies with respect, even when his world was crumbling around him. Brian. She stopped at the bottom of his porch steps, suddenly uncertain. What did one say to a man whose life had been turned upside down by circumstances beyond his control? I heard about the trouble. A bitter smile touched his lips. Trouble. That's one word for it. He gestured toward the town, where warm yellow light glowed in windows and smoke rose from chimneys. They've made up their minds already, haven't they? Some have, Catherine admitted, but not all. Not everyone believes. You don't have to spare my feelings, Brian interrupted, though his tone held no bitterness toward her. I know how this town works. How any small town works. A man's reputation is like a house of cards. Takes years to build, seconds to destroy. Catherine climbed the first step, then the second, drawn by something in his voice that spoke of resignation too complete for a man of 52. And what do you intend to do about it? He looked at her then, really looked at her, and for the first time she saw him not as Margaret Sullivan's widowed husband or Ian's father, but as simply a man with intelligent green eyes that had seen too much sorrow, with strong hands that had worked honestly his entire life, with a mouth that seemed designed for smiles even though it had forgotten how to form them. "I intend to keep my head down and let it pass," he said finally. "What else can I do?" "You could fight," Catherine said, surprised by the vehemence in her own voice. "You could demand they find actual evidence before they destroy your name." Brian's laugh held no humor. "Fight? With what? I was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Catherine, I have no alibi except my own word, and apparently that's not worth much these days." "It's worth something to me." The words hung in the air between them, fraught with meaning neither of them was quite ready to examine. Catherine felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she didn't look away from his steady gaze. "Why?" he asked softly. She could have given him a dozen practical reasons. Because she'd observed his character over the years, because the evidence against him was circumstantial at best, because she believed in justice. Instead, she found herself speaking a truth that surprised them both. "Because I've watched you, Brian O'Sullivan. I've seen how you treat people when you think no one is looking. I've seen you slip coins into Mrs. Henderson's purse when her husband's drinking got bad, and I've seen you mend fences for the widow Thompson without ever sending a bill. A man who does those things doesn't crack another man's skull for a few pounds." Brian stared at her for a long moment, and Catherine had the unsettling feeling that he was seeing her, really seeing her, for the first time. The intensity of his gaze made her feel exposed, as if he could read all the loneliness and buried dreams she kept carefully hidden behind her practical exterior. "You notice things," he said finally. "It's a small town," she replied, though they both knew her observation of him had been more particular than that. "Thank you," he said, and the simple words carried a weight that made her chest tight. "It's been a long time since anyone looked at me and saw something other than a broken-down widower." "You're not broken down," Catherine said firmly. "Grieving, yes, but not broken." As she walked home through the gathering darkness, Catherine found her mind racing with thoughts she had no business thinking. She found herself remembering the way Brian had looked at her, not with the polite distance of a neighbor, but with something warmer, more immediate. Something that made her aware of the way her heart had quickened when he stepped closer, the way the evening air had seemed charged with possibility. But more than that, she found herself thinking about the inconsistencies in the case against him. Why would a man planning robbery choose the busiest alley in town? Why would he leave evidence scattered about rather than taking what he came for? And most puzzling of all, why would a man known for his gentle nature suddenly turn violent? The more she thought about it, the more convinced she became that the town was making a terrible mistake. And Catherine McKinnon had never been one to sit quietly by while mistakes were made, especially not when those mistakes threatened to destroy a good man. As she prepared for bed that night, she made a decision that would change both their lives forever. She was going to prove Brian O'Sullivan's innocence, even if she had to turn the entire town of Broken Hill upside down to do it. After all, someone had to believe in him, and apparently, that someone was going to be her. Chapter 2, A Woman Against the Odds. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, the kind of day that made the red earth of Broken Hill glow like burnished copper under the early sun. Catherine opened her store with the same efficiency she brought to everything, but her mind was already working on problems that had nothing to do with inventory or customer service. She had spent the sleepless hours of the night thinking about Brian's situation, and by morning, she had formed the beginnings of a plan. If the town was determined to convict Brian based on gossip and circumstance, then someone needed to find the actual facts. And since Constable Henderson seemed more interested in closing the case quickly than investigating thoroughly, that someone would have to be her. Her first customer of the day was young Tommy Morrison, who worked at the telegraph office and had a weakness for peppermint sticks and gossip in equal measure. "Morning, Miss McKinnon," he said, eyeing the candy jar hopefully. "Terrible business about Mr. Jameson, isn't it?" "Terrible indeed," Catherine agreed, reaching for the jar. "I suppose the constable is working hard to find the real culprit." Tommy's eyes lit up with the pleasure of someone who had information to share. "Oh, he thinks he's got his man already." been asking all sorts of questions about Mr. Sullivan's finances, his drinking habits, whether anyone's seen him acting strange lately. Catherine's hand tightened on the jowl. And what sort of answers is he getting? Well, Tommy lowered his voice conspiratorially. Mrs. Porter told him that Mr. Sullivan owes money all over town, and Mr. Murphy said he'd been drinking more than usual lately, sitting alone and looking angry. Looking angry, Catherine repeated flatly. That's evidence of crime now, is it? Tommy missed the sarcasm entirely. That's what I thought. I mean, if looking angry was a crime, half the town would be in jail. My pa looks angry every morning before his coffee. Despite her growing frustration, Catherine found herself smiling at the boy's innocence. Quite right. Has anyone bothered to ask what time Mr. Jameson was last seen alive? Oh yes, Tommy said eagerly. Mrs. Hartwell saw him locking up his store around 8 o'clock. Said he was carrying that cash box of his, like he always did when he was taking the day's earnings home. Catherine paused in a selection of peppermint sticks. Taking them home? But the cash box was found at the scene. Aye, all broken open and empty. Poor Mr. Jameson must have been waylaid on his way home. The alley behind his store is the shortest path to his house, you know. So Thomas Jameson had been the victim of a robbery, not a burglary. He had been attacked while carrying money, not surprised in his store. It was a small distinction, but one that changed everything about the nature of the crime. Catherine's mind raced as she handed Tommy his candy. If Jameson had been attacked while walking home, then the crime had been opportunistic, not planned. Someone had seen him with the cash box and decided to take it. But who? And more importantly, how could she prove it hadn't been Brian? Her next visitor provided another piece of the puzzle. Though Mrs. Adelaide Thompson, the banker's elderly mother, didn't realize the significance of her information. Such a shock about poor Thomas, Mrs. Thompson said, settling her considerable bulk into the chair Catherine kept by the counter for older customers. And to think it happened right under our noses. Though I must say, I'm not entirely surprised someone took advantage of his habits. His habits? Catherine asked carefully. Oh, you know how he was about that cash box. Carried it home every single night, regular as clockwork. Anyone watching could have learned his routine. Mrs. Thompson shook her head disapprovingly. I told him more than once he should vary his route. Maybe ask young Billy Foster to walk with him. But Thomas was stubborn as a mule about his routines. Did many people know about his habit of carrying the money home? Heavens, child, everyone knew. Thomas wasn't exactly secretive about it. Said he didn't trust banks. Ironic, considering his son-in-law runs one. No, he preferred to keep his money at home, in that old safe of his. As Mrs. Thompson continued chatting about Thomas Jameson's various eccentricities, Catherine's mind was working furiously. If everyone in town knew about Jameson's routine, then the potential suspects included far more than one grieving widower who happened to be walking home from the pub. After Mrs. Thompson left, Catherine decided to conduct a small experiment. She locked up the store and took a walk through town, ostensibly to enjoy the pleasant morning, but actually to trace the routes between key locations. From Murphy's pub to Brian's house, past Jameson's store, took approximately 15 minutes of normal walking. From the pub to the alley where Jameson was found took less than 5 minutes. But here was the crucial detail. From the pub, there were 3 different routes to Brian's house. The most direct took him past Jameson's store, yes, but 2 other routes would have avoided the area entirely. Why would a man planning robbery choose a route that took him directly past his intended victim's store, where he might be seen and remembered? Catherine was pondering this question when she literally ran into Father Mackenzie outside the church. The elderly priest steadied her with gentle hands, his kind eyes crinkling with concern. "Forgive me, Father, I was lost in thought," Catherine said, embarrassed. "No harm done, my dear. These are troubling times for our community. I imagine we are all a bit distracted." Catherine looked at the priest thoughtfully. If anyone in town would have insight into Brian's character, it would be Father Mackenzie. "Father, you've known Brian Sullivan for many years. What sort of man do you believe him to be?" Father Mackenzie's expression grew grave. "A good man, Catherine. a man who has endured more sorrow than most, but who has borne it with dignity and faith. He has never missed a Sunday service since Margaret's death, and his donations to the church have continued even when I know money has been tight. Even recently, especially recently, just last Sunday, he slipped an envelope into the collection with enough to cover the cost of repairing the church roof. When I tried to thank him privately, he asked that I not mention it to anyone. The priest's eyes met hers directly. That's not the action of a man so desperate for money that he would resort to violence. Catherine felt a surge of vindication, followed immediately by a surge of something else. Admiration for Brian's quiet generosity, even in his own time of struggle. That afternoon, as she walked home from the store, Catherine noticed Brian working in his vegetable garden. He looked up as she approached, and she saw that his face was drawn with exhaustion. She also noticed, with a sharp pang of anger, that someone had thrown rocks at his windows during the night. 2 panes were cracked, and shards of glass sparkled in the dirt of his front yard. "Redecorating?" she asked lightly, nodding toward the broken windows. Brian's mouth quirked in what might have been a smile under different circumstances. "Apparently the town has decided on my guilt. I woke this morning to find several improvements to my property. Anyone hurt? Just my pride." He straightened, wiping his hands on his work trousers, "and my faith in human nature." Catherine felt her temper flare. "This is unconscionable. Have you spoken to Constable Henderson?" "About what? Someone throwing rocks in the night? He'd probably suggest I deserved it." Brian's voice held a bitter edge that made Catherine's heart ache. "Besides, I have more pressing concerns than broken windows." "Such as?" Brian hesitated, then seemed to come to a decision. "I received a visit this morning from Mr. Patterson at the mine. It seems my services are no longer required. Apparently, having a suspected criminal on the payroll is bad for business." Catherine stared at him in dismay. "They dismissed you? Without proof, without even waiting for an investigation?" "They have the right to dismiss anyone they choose," Brian said quietly, "and I understand their position. If I were in their place, I might make the same decision." "No," Catherine said fiercely, surprising them both with a vehemence. "You wouldn't, because you have integrity, Brian O'Sullivan, even if no one else in this town seems to remember what that word means." They stood looking at each other in the golden afternoon light, and Catherine felt that strange electricity again, that sense of connection that seemed to bridge the careful distance they had maintained for so many years. Brian's green eyes were intent on her face, and she had the unsettling feeling that he was seeing not just her words, but the emotions driving them. "Why are you doing this?" he asked softly. "Defending me, I mean. It can't be good for your reputation." Catherine lifted her chin defiantly. "Perhaps my reputation could use a little tarnishing. I've been perfectly respectable for 48 years, and where has it gotten me?" "Catherine." "Besides," she continued, determined to lighten the mood before she said something they weren't ready to hear, "someone has to balance out all the unreasonable condemnation with a little unreasonable support. It's only fair." This time Brian did smile, and the transformation of his face made Catherine's breath catch. "Unreasonable support. I like that." "Good, because you're going to get more of it whether you want it or not." Catherine took a step closer, drawn by something in his expression. "I've been asking questions, Brian, about the case, about what really happened that night." His smile faded. "Catherine, you need to be careful. People are already talking about your support for me if you start investigating." "Let them talk," she said dismissively. "I've never been one to worry overmuch about gossip." "This isn't just gossip anymore," Brian said urgently, moving closer to her. "There's real anger building in this town. Real fear. Scared people do stupid things, dangerous things. I won't have you putting yourself at risk for my sake." The concern in his voice, the protective instinct that made him step closer even as he warned her away, sent warmth flooding through Catherine's chest. When had a man last worried about her safety? When had anyone looked at her with such focused attention, such genuine care? "I'm a grown woman, Brian O'Sullivan. she said, though her voice came out softer than she intended. "I can take care of myself." "I know you can," he replied, his voice equally soft. "But that doesn't mean you should have to." They were standing close now, close enough that Catherine could see the silver threads in his dark hair, could smell the honest scent of soap and sun-warmed skin. Close enough that she could see the exact moment when his gaze shifted from her eyes to her mouth and back again. "Catherine," he said, and her name sounded different in his voice, weighted with possibilities neither of them had acknowledged before. "Yes." But before he could answer, the sound of approaching voices broke the spell between them. Catherine stepped back quickly, her heart racing, as a group of townspeople rounded the corner. Their expressions ranged from curious to hostile, and Catherine realized they had been observed in what looked like an intimate conversation. "Miss McKinnon," said Mr. Patterson, the mine supervisor who had dismissed Brian that morning. His tone was coolly disapproving. "I trust everything is appropriate here." Catherine felt her temper rise at the insinuation, but before she could respond, Brian stepped slightly in front of her, his body language protective despite the casual way he leaned against his fence post. "Miss McKinnon was kind enough to stop and check on my well-being," Brian said evenly, "as any good Christian neighbor would do." "Quite," Mr. Patterson replied, though his expression suggested he found nothing particularly Christian about what he had witnessed. "Well, Miss McKinnon, I hope you'll remember that a woman's reputation is a most precious possession. It would be unfortunate if yours were compromised by association with unfortunate elements." Catherine's eyes flashed dangerously. "Mr. Patterson, I appreciate your concern for my welfare, though I must say I find it rather sudden and convenient. However, I am perfectly capable of choosing my own associations based on my own judgment of character. And my judgment tells me that Brian O'Sullivan is a better man than most in this town, present company very much included." The insult hit its mark. Patterson's face flushed red, and several of his companions murmured disapprovingly. But Catherine wasn't finished. "Furthermore," she continued, her voice carrying clearly in the evening air, "I find it fascinating how quickly this town has abandoned one of its most faithful members based on nothing more than the fact that he was walking home at an unfortunate time. If this is the measure of Broken Hill's justice, then perhaps we deserve whatever troubles come our way." With that, she turned on her heel and walked away, leaving Brian staring after her with a mixture of admiration and concern, and the group of townspeople muttering angrily among themselves. As Catherine marched home, her cheeks burning with indignation and something else she wasn't quite ready to name, she realized that she had just made a position in this conflict unmistakably clear. She had chosen sides publicly, dramatically, and probably foolishly. But as she remembered the way Brian had stepped forward to protect her, the way his voice had gentled when he spoke her name, the way his eyes had looked at her as if she was something precious and surprising, Catherine found she couldn't bring herself to regret it. Let them talk. Let them disapprove. She had found something worth fighting for, and she intended to fight with everything she had. Even if she wasn't entirely sure yet whether she was fighting for justice, or for something far more personal and dangerous. Chapter 3. Truth in the Dust. The third week of Brian's unofficial trial by public opinion brought with it a heat wave that seemed to mirror the town's growing hostility. The red dust of Broken Hill hung in the air like a curse, and tempers grew shorter with each passing day. Catherine had continued her quiet investigation, but what she had discovered only deepened the mystery rather than solving it. She had learned that at least 6 other men had been in Murphy's pub that night, any of whom could have followed Thomas Jameson home. She had discovered that 3 strangers had passed through town in the past week, 2 of whom had left abruptly after the tragedy. She had even uncovered the fact that Jameson had been heard arguing with his son-in-law about money just days before his death. But for all her careful detective work, Catherine was no closer to identifying the real killer. And meanwhile, Brian's situation grew more precarious by the day. Someone had painted the word killer across his front door in red paint that looked disturbingly like blood in the harsh afternoon sun. His vegetable garden had been trampled, his fence damaged, and yesterday, Mrs. Henderson had crossed the street rather than walked past his house. Even Father Mackenzie, while still privately supportive, had stopped visiting publicly. Catherine found Brian sitting on his porch that evening, staring out at the horizon with the hollow expression of a man who had given up hope. Her heart clenched at the sight of him, at the way his shoulders curved inward as if trying to make himself smaller, less visible. "Planning to sit there until you become part of the furniture?" she asked lightly, climbing his front steps with the familiarity of someone who no longer waited for invitation. Brian looked up at her, and she was shocked by the exhaustion in his eyes. "Catherine, you shouldn't be here. Not anymore. People are watching your store, talking about you. I won't have your reputation destroyed because of me." "My reputation is my own concern," she said firmly, settling into the chair beside his. "Besides, I have news that might interest you. Unless it's news that the real killer has confessed, I'm not sure I want to hear it." Catherine studied his profile in the golden evening light. "You're giving up." It wasn't a question, and Brian didn't bother to deny it. "What choice do I have? The whole town has decided I'm guilty. My son sends letters from Sydney asking if the rumors he's hearing are true. I have no job, no money, and no prospects. Maybe it will be better for everyone if I just confess." "Better for everyone except the truth," Catherine said sharply. "And except for you, rotting in prison for a crime you didn't commit." "At least I'd be alive," Brian said quietly. "At least Ian wouldn't have to wonder if his father is a criminal. At least you could go back to your normal life without half the town treating you like a pariah." Catherine felt a surge of panic at his resigned tone. The Brian O'Sullivan she had come to know over these past weeks, the man who made her laugh with dry observations about their neighbors' foibles, who listened to her theories with respectful attention, who looked at her as if she were the most fascinating woman in the world. That man was disappearing before her eyes, replaced by someone hollow and defeated. "Is that what you think I want?" she demanded, standing up abruptly. "To go back to my quiet, respectable, utterly lonely existence? To spend the rest of my life wondering what might have happened if I'd fought a little harder for something that mattered?" Brian looked up at her, startled by her vehemence. "Catherine, no, let me finish." She began pacing the length of his small porch, her skirt swishing with each agitated step. "For 20 years, I took care of my parents. I was a dutiful daughter, the responsible one, the woman who never caused trouble or made waves. And when they died, I thought I was finally free to live my own life. But do you know what I discovered? I had no idea how to live my own life. I had been so busy being what other people needed that I had forgotten who I was." She stopped pacing and turned to face him, her eyes blazing with emotion. "And then this happened. This terrible, unfair thing that should never have touched your life. And suddenly I remembered who I am. I'm the woman who doesn't accept injustice quietly. I'm the woman who fights for what's right, even when it's inconvenient. I'm the woman who—" She stopped abruptly, her cheeks flushing. "Who what?" Brian asked softly, rising to his feet. Catherine looked at him. This good man who had been beaten down by circumstances and the cruelty of small minds, and felt her heart break a little. "I'm the woman who has fallen in love with you, you stubborn, honorable fool. And I'll be damned if I let you throw your life away just to make things easier for the rest of us." The words hung in the air between them, raw and honest and terrifying. Brian stared at her, his green eyes wide with shock, and Catherine felt her courage desert her all at once. She had just confessed her love to a man who was contemplating false confession to a capital crime. The timing could hardly have been worse. "Catherine," Brian said, his voice hoarse with emotion. He took a step toward her, then stopped, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. "You don't understand what you're saying. I'm a man with no future, no prospects, nothing to offer." "You're offering me yourself," Catherine interrupted, "and that's everything I want. Even if that self is a convicted criminal." "You're not a criminal," Catherine said fiercely, "and I'm not going to let you become one just because it's convenient for everyone else." Brian closed the distance between them in 2 quick strides, his hands coming up to frame her face with a gentleness that made her breath catch. "Catherine, sweet Catherine, do you have any idea how long I've wanted to hear you say that? How many nights I've lain awake thinking about you, about the way you look at me like I'm worth something." "You are worth something," she whispered, her hands coming up to cover his. "You're worth everything." "Then help me prove it," he said urgently. Not by fighting this battle alone, but by fighting it together. If you found something, if there's evidence that could clear my name." "I have found something," Catherine said, her mind racing with the implications of what she was about to reveal. "I think I know who really killed Thomas Jameson." Brian's hand stilled on her face. "Who?" "Marcus Jameson, Thomas's son-in-law." The name fell between them like a stone dropped in still water, sending ripples of shock and possibility in all directions. Brian stared at her, his expression shifting from hope to disbelief to cautious optimism. "The banker? Catherine, that's a serious accusation. Do you have proof?" "I have pieces," Catherine said, stepping back reluctantly from his touch so she could think clearly. "Marcus Jameson has been struggling financially. His bank has been making loans it can't collect, and there have been rumors about irregularities in the books. Thomas held a controlling interest in the bank, and he'd been asking uncomfortable questions about Marcus's management." "That's motive," Brian said slowly. "But there's more." Mrs. Thompson mentioned that Thomas kept all his money at home because he didn't trust banks. But what if he didn't trust his son-in-law specifically? What if he had discovered something about Marcus's dealings and was planning to expose him? Brian's eyes sharpened with understanding. "You think Marcus followed him that night?" "I think Marcus knew Thomas's routine better than anyone. He knew about the cash box, knew which route Thomas took home every night. And unlike a stranger passing through town, Marcus would have known exactly when and where to strike." Catherine paused, her mind working through the implications. "There's something else. I checked the Telegraph records. Tommy Morrison was very helpful. Marcus sent a telegram to Adelaide the morning after the tragedy, telling his wife not to return from a visit to her sister just yet. Why would he want to keep her away if he was grieving the loss of his father-in-law?" Brian was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the darkening sky. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful but cautious. "It's a compelling theory, Catherine, but theory isn't proof. And Marcus Jameson is one of the most respected men in town. No one will believe accusations against him without solid evidence." "Then we'll get solid evidence," Catherine said with determination that surprised them both. "Tonight?" "Tonight?" Brian looked at her as if she had suggested they fly to the moon. "Catherine, what are you planning?" "Marcus lives alone now, with Adelaide still visiting her sister. His house is dark by 10 o'clock every night. I've been watching. If he killed Thomas for money, he would have hidden that money somewhere safe, somewhere private." "You're talking about breaking into a man's house," Brian said slowly. "Catherine, that's exactly what we are going to do," she said firmly. "Because tomorrow morning, if we don't find evidence to clear your name, you're planning to walk into Constable Henderson's office and confess to a crime you didn't commit. I won't let that happen." Brian stared at her for a long moment, and Catherine could see the internal battle playing out across his features. The cautious, law-abiding part of him warred with the desperate part that wanted to believe in a plan, wanted to fight for their future. "If we are caught." "We won't be caught," Catherine said with more confidence than she felt. "I know this town, Brian. I know every alley, every shadow, every dog that barks at strangers. We can do this. And if we don't find anything..." Catherine met his gaze steadily. "Then at least we'll have tried. At least we'll know we didn't give up without a fight." Brian was quiet for another moment, then slowly nodded. "All right, but we do this my way. We are careful, we are quiet, and at the first sign of trouble, we run. I won't have you arrested as my accomplice." "Agreed," Catherine said, though privately she had no intention of running if it meant leaving Brian behind. They spent the next 2 hours planning their approach, mapping out routes and timing, discussing what they were looking for and where they might find it. As they talked, Catherine found herself marveling at the change in Brian's demeanor. The defeated man who had been contemplating confession had been replaced by someone focused and determined, someone who had found a reason to fight. At 11:30, they made their way through the darkened streets of Broken Hill, moving carefully from shadow to shadow. The town was quiet except for the distant sound of voices from Murphy's pub and the occasional bark of a dog disturbed by their passage. Marcus Jameson's house sat on a small rise overlooking the main street, a substantial two-story building that spoke of prosperity and respectability. All the windows were dark, just as Catherine had predicted. They approached from the rear, where a small garden provided cover, and the back door was hidden from the street. Brian produced a small knife from his pocket and worked carefully at the lock, his face tense with concentration. "Where did you learn to do that?" Catherine whispered. "You pick up all sorts of skills when you're trying to fix things for a living," he murmured back, "including how to get into places that are locked when they shouldn't be." The lock clicked open, and they slipped inside, their hearts pounding in the darkness. Catherine had brought a small lantern, but they dared not light it until they were sure the house was truly empty. They searched the main floor first, the parlor, the kitchen, Marcus's small office. It was in the office that they found the first piece of evidence, a ledger that showed the bank's accounts in far worse condition than anyone suspected. Several large loans had been made to businesses that didn't exist, and the signatures on the loan documents looked suspiciously similar despite supposedly coming from different borrowers. "He's been embezzling," Brian whispered, studying the ledger by the faint light of Catherine's carefully shielded lantern. "Thomas must have discovered it." "That's motive," Catherine agreed, "but it's not proof he killed Thomas." They continued their search, moving upstairs to the bedrooms. It was in Marcus's bedroom, hidden behind a loose board in the closet floor, that they found what they were looking for: the cash box. Thomas Jameson's cash box, the one that had supposedly been broken open and emptied at the scene of the crime. Here it sat, intact and containing a substantial amount of money. "That's impossible," Catherine breathed. "The cash box at the scene was a different box," Brian finished. "Marcus must have substituted it, made it look like a robbery gone wrong." They were so focused on their discovery that neither of them heard the soft footsteps on the stairs behind them. It wasn't until a familiar voice spoke from the doorway that they realized they were no longer alone. "I must say, this is disappointing," Marcus Jameson said calmly. He stood in the doorway, fully dressed despite the late hour, holding a rifle with the casual confidence of someone who knew how to use it. "I had hoped the town would be satisfied with convicting Mr. Sullivan. I certainly never expected anyone to be clever enough to look in the right place." Catherine felt her blood turn to ice, but she forced herself to remain calm. "Hello, Marcus. Working late tonight?" Marcus smiled, but it was an expression devoid of warmth. "I saw lights moving around my house. Naturally, I came to investigate. Imagine my surprise to find Broken Hill's most wanted man and his accomplice rifling through my belongings. We found the cash box, Marcus," Brian said quietly, straightening to his full height, "and the bank records. We know what you did." "Do you?" Marcus asked conversationally. "And what exactly do you think you know?" "We know you've been embezzling money from the bank," Catherine said, finding her voice. "We know Thomas discovered your theft and confronted you about it. We know you killed him to keep him quiet." Marcus's smile widened. "Very good, Miss McKinnon. You always were cleverer than most people gave you credit for. Yes, I killed Thomas. The old fool was going to ruin me, destroy everything I'd worked to build. He couldn't just look the other way, couldn't understand that sometimes a man has to take extraordinary measures to survive. So you followed him home from his store," Brian said. "You knew his routine, knew he would be carrying the day's receipts." "Child's play," Marcus agreed. "I waited in the alley, struck him down, took his money. Then I went home, got another cash box from my own collection, broke it open and scattered some coins around to make it look like a botched robbery. I must admit, I was delighted when suspicion fell on you, Sullivan. It solved my problem very neatly." Catherine felt a surge of rage at his casual tone, at the way he spoke of Thomas's death, as if it were merely an inconvenience. "You let an innocent man suffer for your crime." "An innocent man who was conveniently in the wrong place at the wrong time," Marcus corrected. "Really, it was almost too perfect. The grieving widower, the man struggling with debt, the convenient witness who saw him walking toward the scene of the crime. I couldn't have planned it better if I tried." "And what do you plan to do now?" Brian asked, his voice steady despite the rifle pointed at his chest. "Kill us too." Marcus considered this for a moment, his head tilted thoughtfully. "I'm afraid so. You see, you've created quite a problem for me. I can't let you leave here knowing what you know. But I also can't make it look like another robbery. That will be too much of a coincidence." He paused, his eyes lighting up with inspiration. But what if the wanted criminal Brian O'Sullivan, growing desperate as the net closed around him, decided to take hostages? What if he broke into my house, threatened poor Miss McKinnon, and I was forced to shoot him in defense? And what if, tragically, Miss McKinnon was also killed in the struggle? Catherine felt her mouth go dry with fear, but she forced herself to think clearly. Marcus was standing in the doorway, blocking their only exit. The window behind them was too small to climb through, and even if they could, it was a long drop to the ground below. But then she remembered something. Marcus's own arrogance was his weakness. He wanted to explain himself, wanted them to understand how clever he had been. And every moment he spent talking was a moment they could use to their advantage. "Very ingenious," she said, taking a small step backward toward the window. "But there's one problem with your plan." "Oh? And what's that?" "You're not the only one who knows the truth now." Catherine reached behind her and pushed the window open, letting the cool night air flow into the room. "I left a letter with Father Mackenzie, to be opened if anything happened to me. A letter detailing everything we discovered about you." It was a complete lie, but Marcus's face paled slightly. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" Catherine asked, taking another step backward. "Are you willing to bet your life on it?" For a moment, Marcus hesitated, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. And in that moment of hesitation, Brian acted. He lunged forward, tackling Marcus around the waist and sending them both crashing to the floor. The rifle went off with a deafening roar, the bullet embedding itself in the ceiling. Catherine screamed, both from shock and to raise as much noise as possible. In a town as small as Broken Hill, a gunshot at midnight would bring people running. Brian and Marcus rolled on the floor, fighting for control of the rifle. Marcus was younger and had been living an easier life, but Brian had the strength that came from years of manual labor and the desperation of a man fighting for his freedom and his love. Catherine looked around frantically for something to help, and her eyes fell on the heavy brass candlestick on Marcus's bedside table. Without hesitation, she grabbed it and brought it down hard on Marcus's head. Marcus went limp, and Brian quickly rolled away, breathing hard. They could already hear voices outside, people calling out an alarm, footsteps running toward the house. "The letter?" Brian panted. "Catherine, what did he call your bluff about the letter?" Catherine smiled grimly. "Then I suppose I'd better go write one very quickly." But as it turned out, there was no need for any more deception. Constable Henderson arrived within minutes, along with half the town, drawn by the gunshot and Catherine's screams. The evidence was overwhelming. The cash box, the bank records, Marcus's own confession that Brian and Catherine had both heard. By dawn, Marcus Jameson was in custody. Brian O'Sullivan was a free man, and the town of Broken Hill was buzzing with the news of how spectacularly wrong they had all been. As the sun rose over the red earth of the Outback, Catherine and Brian stood on his front porch, exhausted but victorious. The word killer had been scrubbed from his door, replaced by flowers and notes of apology from neighbors who were ashamed of how quickly they had turned against him. "So," Brian said, slipping his arm around Catherine's waist and pulling her close, "what happens now?" Catherine leaned into his warmth, marveling at how right it felt to be held by him. "Now we rebuild your life. Find you a new job, repair your reputation, write to Ian and tell him his father is innocent." "Our life," Brian corrected gently. "If you'll have me, that is, I know I don't have much to offer." Catherine silenced him with a kiss that tasted of promise and possibility. When they broke apart, both were breathless. "Brian O'Sullivan," she said, her eyes sparkling with mischief, "are you asking me to marry you?" "I'm asking you to take a chance on a man who's been given a second chance at happiness," he replied. "I'm asking you to build a life with someone who loves you more than he ever thought possible." "Well, when you put it like that," Catherine said, pretending to consider, How could I refuse? Though I should warn you, I have absolutely no intention of being a quiet, obedient wife. Brian's laughter filled the morning air, rich and joyful and full of life. Catherine McKinnon, I would be disappointed with anything less. As they stood together watching the sun paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Catherine reflected on the strange turns life could take. 3 weeks ago, she had been a spinster shopkeeper with a quiet, predictable existence. Now she was engaged to be married to a man who had been accused of taking a life, and she had risked everything to prove his innocence. "Do you think we'll be happy?" she asked, suddenly struck by the enormity of what they were undertaking. Brian turned her in his arms so he could look into her eyes. "I think we'll be many things," he said seriously. "Happy, frustrated, passionate, argumentative, devoted, and occasionally completely exasperated with each other." "That sounds perfect," Catherine said, and meant it. "Besides," Brian added with a grin, "any woman brave enough to break into a house and knock a man unconscious with a candlestick is certainly brave enough to handle marriage to me." "Flatterer," Catherine accused, but she was smiling as she said it. As the town of Broken Hill came to life around them, as neighbors began to venture out with sheepish smiles and tentative waves, Brian and Catherine began planning their future together. It would not be an easy life. The Outback was harsh, money would be tight, and small-town memories were long. But they would face it together, this woman who had never learned to back down from a fight, and this man who had never stopped believing in doing the right thing. And if anyone in town had doubts about whether their love would last, they had only to watch the way Brian looked at Catherine when she argued with the banker about interest rates, or the way Catherine's face lit up when Brian walked into the store at the end of each workday. Some love stories begin with love at first sight. Others begin with convenience or arrangement or social expectation. But the best love stories, the ones that last, begin with respect, grow through adversity, and flourish in the soil of absolute trust. Brian and Catherine's love story was definitely one of the best. I hope you've enjoyed this tale of love, courage, and second chances in the Australian Outback. Now I'd love to hear from you. Write in the comments below if you've ever stood by someone when no one else believed in them. Have you ever been the lone voice of support when everyone else had given up? Your stories of loyalty and courage inspire others to be brave when it matters most. The end. In the red dust and endless sky of Broken Hill, two hearts found each other against all odds. Sometimes the greatest adventures aren't about discovering new places. They're about discovering the courage to fight for what matters most.